Think about the last time you filled up your gas tank. You probably didn't think about Iran. Most people don't. But the price you paid, the number on that pump, was quietly shaped by a decision made in Washington that almost no one is talking about the right way. Curious, somewhere between the headlines about negotiations and the noise about nuclear deals, something specific happened. The United States, under Donald Trump's administration, chose to pause targeted strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure. Not all military options. Not diplomacy. Specifically, the oil fields, the refineries, the export terminals. Thoughtful, and the question that serious analysts are asking, the question the mainstream coverage keeps skating past, is not whether this was a peace gesture. It's who benefits from oil staying in the ground, and who loses when it doesn't. Stay with me, because the answer involves players you haven't heard mentioned once in this story. I've spent years studying the structural relationship between geopolitical decisions and commodity markets, the way that what looks like a military or diplomatic move almost always has a financial skeleton underneath it. Thoughtful, the history of oil and power is littered with decisions that made no strategic sense until you followed the money. What I found when I looked at this particular pause, this specific restraint on Iranian energy targets, is consistent with a pattern that has repeated itself at least 4 times in the last 50 years. Curious, and the pattern has almost nothing to do with diplomacy. Here is my thesis. Thoughtful, the decision to pause attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure is not primarily a diplomatic signal, it is a market management move, and the real winners are not the actors the press is covering. Let's start with what everyone agrees on. Iran exports somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7 million barrels of oil per day, according to tracking data from CPLR and the EIA. Curious, that sounds like a lot. In global terms, a world that consumes roughly 103 million barrels per day, it's about 1.6% of supply. On paper, not decisive. But oil markets don't price on averages. They price on fear, on marginal barrels, on what could happen next Tuesday. And that's the first thing mainstream coverage gets wrong. They frame the Iranian energy question as if it's about volume. It isn't. It's about signal. Thoughtful, when Washington keeps Iranian energy infrastructure intact, it is sending a price signal. It is saying this supply stays available, or at minimum, it stays uncertain rather than definitively gone. That uncertainty itself is valuable to specific actors. Now, who are those actors? Let's build the map. The first layer is the obvious one, Iran itself. Tehran does not want its oil infrastructure destroyed. Every day the pause holds is a day the Islamic Republic retains the physical capacity to export, even if sanctions limit the buyers. The infrastructure is leverage, future leverage in any negotiation, present leverage as a deterrent. But here's where it gets less obvious. And this is what I don't see discussed anywhere in the mainstream coverage. The second layer is the Gulf producers, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This sounds counterintuitive because Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are not friends of Tehran. But in commodity markets, rivals can share interests. If Iranian oil infrastructure were destroyed tomorrow, global supply would tighten. Prices would spike. And the Gulf states, swimming in spare capacity, would gain immediate windfall revenue. So why would they want the pause to hold? The answer is that not all Gulf interests run through Riyadh's energy ministry. Some run through Washington's treasury. According to BIS data and IMF reports on Gulf sovereign wealth fund positioning, significant portions of Gulf financial reserves are parked in dollar-denominated assets, including U.S. equities and debt instruments. An oil price shock of the kind an Iranian infrastructure strike would cause doesn't just raise Gulf revenues. It also raises inflation, hits U.S. markets, and puts pressure on the Federal Reserve. The Gulf states, as the Peterson Institute has noted in analyses of their financial integration with the West, have learned that a stable oil price in the $75 to $90 range is more valuable to their long-term portfolio than a $120 spike that creates political instability in their primary investment markets. And this is the game theory that Washington, at the economic advisor level, if not always at the political level, understands. Destroying Iranian energy infrastructure is not a zero-sum win for the US. It's a move that helps one side of the board while quietly damaging another. The third layer is where the real story lives: US domestic energy producers. American shale producers operate on a price band. Too low, and wells are not economical to drill. Too high, and political pressure for relief increases, regulatory risk rises, and the electoral arithmetic shifts. The sweet spot, the price band where American producers maximize both revenue and political stability, sits roughly between $70 and $90 per barrel, according to Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas surveys of U.S. energy executives. An intact Iranian energy sector, even a sanctions-limited one, helps keep global prices from spiking too far above that band. It functions, paradoxically, as a pressure valve. The Biden administration understood this. The Trump administration, for all its rhetorical aggression toward Tehran, faces the same structural reality: American energy producers don't actually benefit from oil at $120. They benefit from oil at $80, consistently, predictably, with minimal geopolitical noise. And yet, and this is the fourth layer, the one that closes the historical loop, the pause is not permanent. It never is. According to patterns documented by Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations in analyses of US-Iran tensions since 1979, Washington has consistently cycled between pressure and restraint on Iranian energy. The restraint periods tend to coincide with domestic economic stress or electoral cycles. The pressure periods tend to coincide with moments when Washington needs to demonstrate resolve to regional allies or when a negotiation needs to be accelerated. The historical comparator that comes closest to this moment is 2019. In May and June of that year, the US escalated economic pressure on Iran through sanctions, tanker incidents raised fears of infrastructure strikes, and then, quietly, Washington held back from kinetic action. Oil prices moved. Specific actors in commodity markets moved with them. And 6 months later, the pressure resumed. We are, by most indicators I track, in an equivalent structural moment. The pause is real. The economic logic behind it is traceable. And the question of how long it holds is not primarily a diplomatic question. It is a question about domestic US economic data, about Federal Reserve posture, and about the next 6 months of oil market positioning. The invisible chain here, the dependency that nobody names, is the one connecting Iranian barrels not destroyed to American shale economics, to Gulf sovereign wealth stability, to the price you pay at the pump. Every link in that chain has a stakeholder. And every stakeholder is watching this pause more carefully than any diplomat. Washington has, structurally, 3 options from here. Option 1, thoughtful, hold the pause indefinitely, framing it as a diplomatic overture while managing oil markets in the $75 to $85 range. The cost is credibility with Israel and certain Gulf allies who want a harder posture toward Tehran. The benefit is domestic economic stability. Option 2, resume pressure on Iranian energy, not necessarily kinetic strikes, but additional sanctions targeting buyers, especially in Asia. The cost is a supply shock risk and a potential market reaction that could spike inflation. The benefit is leverage in any nuclear or regional negotiation. Option 3, a negotiated arrangement, not a formal deal, but a tacit understanding where Iranian barrels continue to flow at controlled volumes in exchange for behavioral restraint on Iran's part in proxy conflicts. Curious, the Brookings Institution has documented similar tacit arrangements in the 1990s and early 2000s. The cost is political, it's not sellable domestically as a win. The benefit is that it's probably the most economically rational outcome for all major stakeholders. Scenario 1, the pause holds through the next 6 months. Oil stays in the $75 to $88 range. US inflation data remains manageable. Washington claims credit for de-escalation. Tehran quietly increases exports through secondary markets. No formal deal, no formal conflict. Sarcastic, the status quo, dressed up as strategy. Scenario 2, surprised, a provocation, a proxy attack, a tanker incident, a regional escalation, forces Washington's hand. The pause ends. Strikes or heavy sanctions resume. Oil spikes toward $100 or above. The Federal Reserve faces a new inflation input it didn't account for. Markets reprice risk across emerging market economies dependent on energy imports. Scenario 3. A back-channel agreement takes shape, probably brokered through Oman as it has been historically. Iranian volumes are capped at an agreed level. Washington stops threatening infrastructure. Relieved, both sides claim victory in their domestic narratives. Oil stabilizes. This is the scenario that commodity analysts at RBC and Capital Economics consider most likely over an 18-month horizon, though none will say so publicly. Scenario 4. The pause becomes permanent by default, not because of a deal, but because the economic cost of ending it proves too high for whoever holds power in Washington. Infrastructure goes undamaged not by choice but by constraint. This is, historically, how many of these pauses end, not with a decision, but with the absence of one. If you are the kind of person who reads think tank reports at midnight, who cross-references commodity data with geopolitical news, who has spent years noticing that the official explanation for a foreign policy decision rarely matches the economic logic underneath it, then you already felt something was missing from the coverage of this story. Thoughtful, what was missing is the acknowledgement that energy decisions at this level are never purely strategic. They are always, at the same time, market decisions. And market decisions have beneficiaries. The depth I want you to take from this is not cynicism. It's a more precise analytical lens. Pause when the next pause happens, and there will be a next pause, in this conflict or another. The first question to ask is not what signal is Washington sending to Tehran. The first question is, who holds a position in the oil market that benefits from this announcement? Follow that, and the diplomatic language will start to make a different kind of sense. Let me bring it back to where we started. You fill up your tank. You don't think about Iran. But somewhere in the chain of decisions that set the price on that pump, a call was made in Washington about whether to destroy or preserve infrastructure 10,000 kilometers away. Thoughtful, that call was shaped by shale economics, sovereign wealth positioning, electoral calendars, and commodity market dynamics that most foreign policy coverage simply doesn't cover. The decision to pause was real. The economic logic behind it is documented and traceable. The question of how long it holds is, fundamentally, a question about the next data release, the next proxy incident, and the next set of incentives facing actors who will never say publicly what they actually want. Size history suggests these pauses last until they don't. The 1979 pattern, the 1996 pattern, the 2019 pattern, each one ended not because the underlying conflict was resolved, but because the economic and political calculus shifted. So here is the question I want to leave with you, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. If you were advising Washington right now, knowing what you know about the oil market economics, the Gulf dynamics, the Iranian leverage, which of the 4 scenarios I outlined would you consider the most likely, and why? The most rigorous answer I see in the comments will be featured in the next video. The sources for this analysis are listed below. I'll see you in the next one.